Sam, are you out of your tree?
Well, I'm sorry, but she made me furious and I had to get it off my chest.
A hit from the moment it premiered in 1964, it quickly became an era-defining sitcom, or so it seemed. Bewitched, just hearing the name, probably brings a familiar image to mind. Samantha, effortlessly charming, giving her little nose wiggle and solving problems with a flick of magic. But what if I told you that this iconic show came very close to vanishing after just one season? Yeah, seriously. Before the laugh tracks, the nose wiggles, and the 8-season run, Bewitched was skating on thin ice. The reason? It's not as simple as you'd think. Behind the scenes, cracks were already forming. Tensions, controversies, and doubts that nearly pulled the plug on the whole thing. So, what was going on? And how did Bewitched defy the odds to become one of the most famous TV shows of all time? Let's find out. For a show that seemed so effortlessly magical on screen, things behind the scenes were anything but smooth. From the very start, ABC wasn't entirely sold on the concept of Bewitched. Sure, the idea of a witch giving up her powers for love had potential, but network executives weren't convinced it could work long-term. The 1960s were a conservative time for television. Viewers wanted safe, familiar family sitcoms, not fantastical stories about witches and spells. Would audiences really relate to a wife who zapped away her daily problems instead of solving them the normal way? ABC wasn't so sure, and neither were the sponsors footing the bill. Advertisers were skittish, to say the least. They worried the show's magical themes, especially with Samantha as the lead, might alienate traditional families. After all, this was the same era where couples on TV often slept in separate beds, just to keep things proper. So, a witch as a primetime lead? That was risky. Too risky in their eyes. And then, there were the creative arguments. William Asher, the showrunner, was also married to its star, Elizabeth Montgomery, a dynamic that already added a layer of pressure. Asher wanted Bewitched to stand out, to push boundaries with its humor and supernatural elements. But ABC executives? They wanted something tamer, more predictable. Let's just say those conversations behind closed doors weren't exactly harmonious. Even if the concept of the show had the network worried, the challenges didn't stop there. Casting proved to be another major headache. Finding the right actor to play Samantha's mortal husband, Darren, wasn't as simple as it seemed. Dick York wasn't the studio's first choice for the role. In fact, some executives doubted whether he could handle the comedic demands or strike the right chemistry with Elizabeth Montgomery. York himself later admitted that working on Bewitched wasn't always easy. "The scripts were great, but the schedule was brutal," he said in an interview. Physical exhaustion was something he battled even in the early seasons, a struggle that would later become an even bigger issue. Pressure wasn't just limited to York. Elizabeth Montgomery found herself at the center of almost every scene, a situation that required her to carry much of the show's weight. Combine that with the reality of being directed by her husband, William Asher, and it created a dynamic that, according to insiders, could be tense. It's been reported that Montgomery often felt uneasy with how her character was written early on. While the magic was fun, Samantha's submissiveness to Darren, who constantly told her to restrain herself, clashed with Montgomery's own strong personality. She played the role convincingly, but behind the scenes, there was an unspoken frustration brewing. In an old interview, Montgomery said, "I wanted Samantha to have fun with her powers, but we had to keep it relatable. The balance wasn't always easy." With ratings holding steady and an audience beginning to grow, you'd think ABC would have started to relax. But instead, financial concerns were becoming a serious issue behind the scenes. Producing a show like Bewitched wasn't cheap. The special effects, the twinkling magic, the floating objects, the disappearing acts, all came with a hefty price tag that the network wasn't thrilled about. Every element of Samantha's powers burned through budget faster than expected, and ABC wasn't keen on committing more money to a concept they still considered risky. William Asher later explained, "There was constant pressure from ABC to tighten things up. They were never entirely convinced we could keep delivering on the premise. TV is a business. It always comes back to the numbers. Some executives felt the solution was to scale back the magic altogether. Cutting down on special effects, they reasoned, would make the series cheaper to produce and perhaps broaden its appeal by grounding it further in reality. The idea didn't gain traction. It was clear that the magic was the heart of the show. But just the fact that it was suggested shows how much doubt the network had during the first season. At the same time, sponsors were also feeling uneasy. Around the 7th or 8th episode, concerns started to pour in from advertisers who were uncomfortable with the show's themes of witchcraft. While light-hearted, Samantha's magical powers raised questions about how the show might be received in more conservative areas. There was even a push from one sponsor to tone down the use of the word witch and refer to Samantha's abilities as mystical talents instead, to avoid any controversy. Asher summed it up in his own words. "We were getting notes from everyone, executives, sponsors, advertisers, on what we could and couldn't do. It's a miracle we got through that first year at all." As behind-the-scenes challenges mounted, one constant anchor for the show was Elizabeth Montgomery herself. While the network had its doubts about the premise, Montgomery's performance as Samantha became impossible to ignore. Even ABC executives, who initially questioned the viability of the show, began to acknowledge that her portrayal brought an irreplaceable charm to an otherwise risky concept. But what many don't know is that Montgomery played a much bigger role in keeping Bewitched on air than just her acting. William Fraug, then an executive producer at ABC, later mentioned in an interview, "Elizabeth was a big part of why the show stayed alive. She wasn't just the star. She had a presence in meetings. She pushed for things she believed in, and she wasn't afraid to push back when necessary." Montgomery's influence became particularly apparent when network executives attempted to tweak the tone of her character to match more traditional TV roles of the time. From the beginning, Samantha's powers had been a source of tension in her marriage to Darren. Executives wanted to lean even harder into the idea of Samantha as a submissive wife, constantly apologizing for her magical nature. But Montgomery reportedly objected to oversimplifying the character and losing what made her unique. In an interview years later, Montgomery reflected on this, saying, "I wanted Samantha to be relatable, but she also had to have her own voice. Her powers might have been a problem for Darren, but they weren't a problem for her. That balance was important to me." It wasn't just about tone, either. Montgomery also had sway when it came to keeping the storylines engaging. She reportedly stepped in to question rewrites that reduced Samantha's role in episodes or weakened her presence in key scenes. Her star power, combined with her advocacy for the character, made her someone difficult to dismiss, even for the cautious executives at ABC. Despite all this behind-the-scenes effort, Montgomery knew how fragile the situation was during that first season. She later admitted, "We were constantly walking a line. Nobody really knew what would work long-term. We were just finding it as we went along." While tensions behind the scenes raged on, the ultimate fate of Bewitched would depend on one thing: the ratings. By mid-season, ABC was keeping a close eye on audience numbers. The network had taken several missteps with new shows that year, leaving it desperate for a hit. But Bewitched remained on shaky ground due to the high production costs and lingering doubts about its broader appeal. For weeks, viewership numbers were closely scrutinized. At first, the ratings were solid but not groundbreaking. However, a turning point came when the series aired its episode, A Vision of Sugar Plums, which featured Samantha using her powers to brighten Christmas for an orphaned boy. The storyline, which combined fantasy with heartfelt family themes, resonated with audiences and earned one of the show's highest ratings so far. It wasn't just about the numbers. It proved that Bewitched could hit the right emotional notes and connect with viewers in a deeply personal way. Reflecting on that turbulent first season, William Asher later said, "That episode saved us. It proved to the network that the magic wasn't just a gimmick. It had substance, and audiences were responding to it. Even with this success, the network wasn't immediately convinced. It wasn't until the season finale posted similarly strong ratings that ABC finally committed to renewing the series for a second season. This decision came with strings attached, though. Costs were still an issue, and network executives made it clear that the pressure to deliver consistent numbers would be even greater moving forward. Dick York, who played Darren, later described the uncertainty everyone felt. "Nobody thought past the first year. We all knew it could just end right there, no matter how good the show was. That kind of tension never really went away." In the end, Bewitched barely made it through its first season. It wasn't the runaway hit ABC hoped for right away, but the steady improvement in ratings during the second half of the season bought it enough goodwill to continue. The gamble paid off, not without compromises, but enough to keep the show alive for the time being.